Macbeth, Act 2, Scene 3. An audience in Shakespeare's day, when they went to the theatre, would have expected to have had a fully rounded afternoon's entertainment. Even if they were watching a tragedy, they would be entertained by occasional comic interludes. And that's how Act 2, Scene 3 begins. It is a comedy interlude within the tragedy. One of the reasons that Shakespeare puts this moment of comedy here is, if you think about it, we've just had Act 2, Scene 2, the murder scene. So it's been a very, very dark and very tense scene. In fact, the play's been very dark since the very, very first scene of the play. So after the murder scene, Shakespeare just lightens the mood a little bit through the character of the porter. Now, this isn't laugh-out-loud comedy, although there are moments of humour which we would describe as bawdy humour, rude humour, that would have made the audience laugh. The porter's first speech, however, actually contains moments of dark humour which are very much in keeping with the tone of the play so far. The porter is a very lowly character. He's one of the servants. It's his job to open the gate to anyone who might be arriving at Macbeth's castle. The start of Act 2, Scene 3 takes place only a few moments after the end of Act 2, Scene 2, because remember, at the end of that murder scene, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth had been interrupted by the sound of the knocking at the gate. So the action shifts to the gate, and the porter, when he arrives on the scene, is not in the best of moods. The reason being that clearly the celebratory and party atmosphere has been extended to the servants of Macbeth's castle, and they've been enjoying themselves as well. The porter, unfortunately for him, has enjoyed himself rather too much, and he is very drunk at this point. He is approaching complete inebriation, so he is not in the very best of moods. So the stage directions tell us that we are in Macbeth's castle. The porter enters, and there is knocking at the gate. The porter says, "Here's a knocking indeed. If a man were porter of Hellgate, he should have old turning the key." You might notice from just the layout of the text on the page that when Shakespeare writes the porter's dialogue, he actually writes it in prose, not poetry, and it is often the case that the lowlier characters in Shakespeare's plays are given prose and not verse to speak. So we shouldn't be surprised here that the porter is actually speaking in prose and not poetry. The dark tone of the comedy, if you like, begins almost immediately, because the porter comes on stage really not feeling that great because he's so drunk. And he imagines, as he goes to open the gate, that he is a porter of Hellgate, the gate of hell. Now, one point to note about some of the lowlier characters in Shakespeare. Shakespeare often gives the lower class characters moments of wisdom. Some of the things that they say are actually very perceptive and very wise. There are a number of examples of that in Macbeth, and this is the first one. Without realising it, the porter is actually being very perceptive here. He imagines, as he goes to open the gate, he sort of fantasises, what if I were the gatekeeper of hell, the porter of Hellgate? I'd always be going to the door to open it because so many people go to hell. The reason I'm suggesting he's being perceptive here is that, in a way, because Macbeth has killed God's representative on earth, Macbeth's castle has in a way become a sort of hell. So without realising it, the porter is actually being very perceptive here, imagining that Macbeth's castle is now hell and that he's going to open the gate of that hell. We're told that there is another knock at the gate. The porter, by the way, is not hurrying to the gate. That's why there's so many knocks. He's taking his time getting there. He's not doing his job particularly well. So the knock comes at the gate, and the porter cries out, "Knock, knock, knock! Who's there in the name of Beelzebub?" Now, Beelzebub is the name of one of the demons of hell, so we get plenty of hellish imagery in this speech. He imagines that he opens the gate to hell, and this is who he finds on the other side. "Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time, have napkins enough about you, here you'll sweat for it." So he imagines that he opens the gate to a farmer who's committed suicide. In Shakespeare's day, suicide was considered a sin. It was both a crime and a sin, and if you committed suicide, you'd be going to hell. He pretends that he offers napkins or cloths for the farmer to wipe his face with, because hell is hot, and here you'll sweat for it. Another knock comes at the gate. "Knock, knock, who's there in the other devil's name? Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator." Now here, he imagines that he's talking to somebody who has committed some sort of treason. Again, that's a rather perceptive point from the porter, although he doesn't realise it, because by Macbeth killing the king, Macbeth has committed a form of treason. The key word I want you to focus on here is the word equivocate and the word equivocator. Somebody who equivocates is someone who uses language to conceal the truth, ambiguous language to conceal the truth. It links in with that theme of deception and appearance versus reality that we have within this play. In many respects, Macbeth is an equivocator because he uses ambiguous language in order to disguise the truth of what he's done and, of course, the truth of who he is. There's another knock at the gate. "Knock, knock, knock, who's there? Faith, here's an English tailor, come hither for stealing out of a French hose. Come in, tailor, here you may roast your goose." So the porter then pretends he's opening the gate to a tailor who has stolen some cloth. Stealing, a sin, would send you to hell in the ideologies of Shakespeare's time. Again, you've got that reference, roast your goose, the image of heat, the image of hell. There is another knock. "Knock, knock, never act quiet. What are you?" So the porter's getting really irritated here that the person on the other side of the gate keeps knocking. It's the porter's fault, of course, that the person on the other side of the gate keeps knocking, because he's not getting to the gate quick enough. He's not doing his job quick enough, and he's complaining. He says next, "But this place is too cold for hell. I'll devil porter it no further." The porter realises that he's only fantasising about being in hell. It's not really hell, and one of the reasons he knows that is because this place is too cold for hell. "I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire." So he says, if I carry on playing this game, I'll never stop, because there are so many people and so many professions that lead you to hell. There is another knock. "Anon, anon!" If you remember, anon, which was mentioned by one of the witches very early in the play, anon simply means I'm coming, I'm on my way. And then this is the bit that would probably make the audience chuckle. There's no stage direction here, but as he opens the door, the porter says, "I pray you, remember the porter." What he's doing is he's holding his hand out for a tip. Remember that the servants would have made very, very little money indeed, and they would expect to be tipped by the lords for doing good deeds. The porter is not doing his job very well. He's taken ages to get to the gate, and cheekily, when he opens the gate, he sticks his hand out and says, "I pray you remember the porter." He's asking for his tip. On the other side of the gate are the characters Macduff and Lennox. Now, this is Macduff's first appearance in the play. Lennox we have seen before. Now, just a note on the way that I'm going to, well, if you want to call it, perform this scene. In some versions of Macbeth, directors and actors choose to have Macduff play along with the porter. I don't read Macduff like that. The best versions of Shakespeare's Macbeth that I've seen, when the porter opens the door, Macduff really isn't impressed with the porter. He doesn't find him funny, and he's actually rather irritated that he's been kept waiting so long before the porter bothered to come and open the gate. So I tend to read Macduff as being much more serious and not playing along with the porter. So Macduff says, "Was it so late, friend, you went to bed, that you do lie so late?" He's telling the porter off. He's basically saying, did you go to bed so late that you've overslept and that's why it's taken you so long to open the gate? So he's not impressed at being kept waiting. The porter replies, "Faith, sir, we were carousing till the second cock, and drink, sir, is a great provoker of three things." So he says to Macduff, "Oh yeah, we were carousing, we were partying until the cockerel crew a second time." And then he starts to tell Macduff about the effects of alcohol. Macduff asks him, "What three things does drink especially provoke?" The porter replies, "Marry, sir, nose painting, sleep, and urine." So the three things that the drink provokes: it turns your face red, particularly your nose, hence nose painting. It makes you tired, hence sleep. And it makes you want to go for a wee, hence urine. This is where we start to get into the ruder, bawdier humour. There's nothing sophisticated about what the porter is saying here. Actually, according to the porter, drink provokes more than three things, because the next thing he talks about was not mentioned in his original list. He says to Macduff, "Lechery, sir, it provokes and unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance." Lechery is lustful behaviour. So in other words, what the porter's saying here is alcohol makes you really, really want to have sex. It makes you full of sexual desire. But there's a problem, he says. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. Drink makes you want to have sex, but it also takes away your ability to perform the sex very well because you're just too drunk. So you can see here, of course, at the mention of sex and sexual intercourse, this is where the humour is getting much ruder and much bawdier. And it's going to get a little bit ruder in a minute, I warn you. The porter goes on to say, "Therefore, much drink may be said to be an equivocator with lechery. It makes him and it mars him. It sets him on and it takes him off. It persuades him and disheartens him. Makes him stand to and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in a sleep and giving him the lie, leaves him." You may well have noticed that when the porter brings up this issue of equivocation once again, remember, to equivocate means to use language to conceal the truth. When he brings this subject up again, he speaks in paradoxes. You know, drink makes you want to do one thing, but it stops you doing the very thing that you want to do. And so the porter's language here becomes paradoxical, something that we've seen earlier in the play. Now, when I said it was going to get a little bit ruder, remember that the porter here is talking about the fact that being drunk, being full of alcohol, makes you desire sexual intercourse, but stops you being able to perform it. I will leave it up to your imaginations what the porter is referring to when he says that, bearing in mind he's talking from a male perspective here, when the porter refers to the fact that alcohol makes him stand to and not stand to. Yes, It does mean what you are thinking, and this is again one of those examples of the bawdy humour that Shakespeare incorporates into this scene. Macduff, as far as I'm concerned, is having none of this. "I believe drink gave thee the lie last night." To which the porter replies, "That it did, sir, in the very throat on me. But I requited him for his lie, and I think, being too strong for him, though he took up my legs some time, yet I made a shift to cast him." As you're probably aware, if you have drunk far too much, it makes you feel sick, and it's probably going to make you vomit. And again, Shakespeare gets in a little bit of coarse, crude humour here, by the porter admitting that he's got so drunk that it's made him vomit, but that having vomited he's feeling a little bit better now. I made a shift to cast him. We are then told that as the conversation between Macduff and the porter comes towards its conclusion, that Macbeth has entered the stage. Macduff, still speaking to the porter, says, "Is thy master stirring? Our knocking has awaked him. Here he comes." So Macduff asks, "Is Macbeth awake?" Our knocking must have woken him up, and then he spots him. "Oh, here he comes." And the porter goes. As soon as the porter leaves the stage, that's the end of the comic interlude. We are now back into the business of the tragedy. Lennox, also seeing Macbeth, greets him. "Good morrow, noble sir." Macbeth, putting on that facade of innocence, says, "Good morrow, both." Macduff asks, "Is the king stirring, worthy Thane?" Macbeth replies, "Not yet." Macduff says, "He did command me to call timely on him. I have almost slipped the hour." So that's explaining why Macduff has arrived at the castle. I'm not entirely sure why Macduff isn't already at the castle. Why? Because Macduff is one of the Thanes, yet for some reason he's not actually invited to the feast. I think the reason is simply being that Shakespeare needed a character to come and essentially intrude upon this scene, and Macduff's going to be a very important character later in the play. So Macduff is here to escort the king safely to his next destination. "He, Duncan, did command me to call timely on him. I have almost slipped the hour." There's a sense of irritation in what Macduff says here, because it took the porter so long to open the gate that it's made Macduff late. So he's not impressed at all. Now Macbeth again keeps up that facade, pretending innocence. He says to Macduff, "I'll bring you to him. I'll take you to where the king is sleeping." Macduff makes just a little bit of small talk here. "I know this is a joyful trouble to you, but yet 'tis one. Remember what I've said in previous tutorials. The king coming to a castle, inviting himself to a castle, would have been seen as a great honour, but it would also have put the host to great inconvenience and great expense. That's what Macduff means when he calls it a joyful trouble." Macbeth says, "The labour we delight in physics pain. This is the door." So in his reply, he's simply saying, "Oh, I don't mind the fact that it's cost me a lot of money and, it's used up a lot of food. It was just a great honour to have Duncan here." By this point, they've arrived at the door to Duncan's chamber, or certainly the corridor leading up to Duncan's chamber. Macduff says, "I'll make so bold to call, for 'tis my limited service," and off he goes. This leaves Macbeth and Lennox on stage. Lennox says, "Goes the king hence today? Is the king leaving today?" Macbeth says, "He does. He did appoint so." Now I want you to pay careful attention to what Lennox says next for this reason. Macbeth, in killing the king, has disrupted the natural order. He's gone against the natural order, and he's gone against God's will. In this short speech from Lennox, Lennox comments on the fact that this very night, the night on which Duncan has been murdered, although of course Lennox doesn't know Duncan's been murdered yet, nature behaved in a very strange way. He says this, "The night has been unruly, the night has been stormy. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down. And as they say, lamentings heard in the air, strange screams of death, and prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events new hatched to the woeful time. So we can picture Lennox lying in his bed in whichever castle he's been in. And the night has been stormy, so stormy that the chimneys of his house have been blown down. And there have been lamentings heard in the air. Now, a lament is a song of mourning. So as the wind has been blowing, there has been a sound of mourning and wailing and weeping and grief in the air, as well as, notice, strange screams of death. Nature is reacting to the unnatural event of Duncan's murder. Lennox goes on. The obscure bird clamoured the livelong night. The obscure bird is a reference to an owl, and remember that owls were seen as birds of ill omen at this time, so all through the night the owl was constantly hooting. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake. Now, feverous is a word that you associate with sickness and disease. In a way, what Macbeth has done is sick and diseased. So it's a particularly appropriate word that Shakespeare has Lennox use here. What Lennox is describing when he says the earth was feverous and did shake, there's been an earthquake. Now, as far as I'm aware, you don't get earthquakes very often in Scotland, and so the fact that the earth has shook, there's been an earthquake, shows that things are just not behaving in a normal, natural manner. Nature is reacting to the killing of the king. I rather like this next line because you can see a degree of dark humour in it. Lennox goes into detail about how awful things have been overnight, and Macbeth replies with the rather understated, "'Twas a rough night." If you think about it, it has been a very rough night for Macbeth. He has killed his king. He has committed a terrible crime. He's had blood all over him. And his response is the very understated, "'Twas a rough night." Lennox replies, "My young remembrance cannot parallel a fellow to it." Lennox is only a young man, and he's saying, I know I'm only young, but I cannot ever remember a night being as unruly and frightening and unnatural as the one that has just taken place. Macduff then re-enters the scene. Now remember, Macduff had gone into Duncan's chamber to wake Duncan and make sure that he was ready to be escorted to wherever it is he was going. But of course, now that he's been inside the chamber, he has seen the horror within. Hence the reason when Macduff comes back onto the stage, he proclaims, "Oh, horror, horror, horror! Tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee." Macbeth and Lennox ask together, "What's the matter?" Of course, Macbeth knows exactly what the matter is. Lennox is completely innocent. Macduff replies, "Confusion now hath made his masterpiece. Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple and stole thence the life of the building." Notice how he describes Duncan's murder as sacrilegious. Remember, there was this belief in the divine right of kings, that Duncan was God's representative on earth. Sacrilegious is to do something which is unholy and against God. Metaphorically and poetically, Macduff also refers to Duncan's dead body as the Lord's anointed temple, that life has been stolen from. When a king is crowned, they are anointed with holy oil. And so speaking about Duncan, using this religious metaphor as if Duncan's body is some sort of holy building, a temple, is appropriate given the belief in the divine right of kings that existed at the time. Macbeth, once again feigning innocence, says, "What is't you say, the life?" Lennox just can't get his head round this. "Mean you his majesty? You mean his majesty, the king, has been killed?" Macduff says, "Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon. Do not bid me speak. See and then speak yourselves." So he's saying to Macbeth and Lennox, go and see for yourself what I have seen. Go and look upon it. He says that the sight that will greet them will destroy your sight with a new Gorgon. If you know your classical mythology, your classical Greek, a Gorgon, the most famous one, is Medusa, these half-female, half-serpent-like creatures. When you looked into the eyes of a Gorgon, you would be turned to stone and you would be, well, you'd be dead, you'd be destroyed. And so Macduff, Shakespeare often gets classical allusions into his plays because he had a classical education himself. Macduff uses this classical allusion in order to paint this poetic picture of this terrible sight that's going to await Macbeth and Lennox when they go into the chamber. Macduff now wastes no time in rousing the rest of the household. "Awake! Awake! Ring the alarum bell! Murder and treason! Banquo and Donalbain! Malcolm, awake! Shake off this downy sleep, death's counterfeit, and look on death itself! Up, up, and see the great doom's image! Malcolm, Banquo, as from your graves rise up and walk like sprites to countenance this horror!" So Shakespeare has Macduff calling out to the rest of the household, waking up all of the important members to draw their attention to the fact that Duncan has been killed. He's asked for the alarm bell to be rung, and that indeed happens. The bell rings and Lady Macbeth enters the scene. Again, she's feigning innocence here, and ignorance, of course. "What's the business that such a hideous trumpet calls to parley the sleepers of the house? Speak, speak." So she's pretending that she's got no knowledge of what's going on. Macduff obviously is completely unaware of Lady Macbeth's involvement in the killing, and he says to her, "O gentle lady, 'tis not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell." Now remember that this is a time in which women were seen as the softer sex, and what Macduff is saying here is that he's not going to tell Lady Macbeth what he's seen because he's worried that the shock of it would kill her. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell. Banquo comes onto the scene. "Oh, Banquo, Banquo, our royal master's murdered." Now, this next line might seem really trivial, but actually it's rather important. Lady Macbeth says, "Woe, alas, what, in our house?" And Banquo replies, "Too cruel anywhere." Lady Macbeth really has slipped up a little bit here. She seems to be more concerned in her pretense that Duncan has been murdered in her house, in Macbeth's castle. And Banquo's reply, "Too cruel anywhere," it's as if he's saying to her here, Duncan being murdered anywhere would be cruel. Why are you so bothered about the fact that it's in your castle? Duncan's death would be terrible anywhere. It's not just made more terrible because it's happened in your house. Lady Macbeth hasn't been particularly careful here. I'm not suggesting that she has necessarily aroused suspicion, but one of the reasons I draw your attention to this is because Lady Macbeth's faculties and her ruthlessness and her intelligence and perception are starting to dwindle a little. She is starting to make mistakes. Banquo carries on. "Dear Duff," he's talking to Macduff, he's using it almost like a friendly nickname. "Dear Duff, I prithee contradict thyself and say it is not so. Please tell me that what you've just said isn't the case, that Duncan isn't dead." Macbeth and Lennox come back onto the scene. Macbeth says, "Had I but died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed time, for from this instant there's nothing serious in mortality. All is but toys, renown and grace is dead, the wine of life is drawn, and the mere lees is left this vault to brag of." Macbeth is again putting on a facade of innocence. He's pretending that he is deeply, deeply upset by Duncan's murder. Then Malcolm and Donalbain come in. And of course, Malcolm and Donalbain are the ones who are most directly affected by their father's murder. Donalbain says, "What's amiss? What's wrong?" Macbeth turns to him and says, "You are, and do not know it. The spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped. The very source of it is stopped." Macduff comes in with the much more direct, "Your royal father's murdered." Malcolm, in shock, says, "Oh, by whom?" Lennox replies, "Those of his chamber, as it seemed, had done it. Their hands and faces were all badged with blood. So were their daggers, which unwiped we found upon their pillows. They stirred and were distracted. No man's life was to be trusted with them." So it seems at face value that Lennox believes that the guards on Duncan's chamber had killed Duncan, because when he and Macbeth arrived to see Duncan's dead body, there were the guards all distracted and confused, covered in blood, with the daggers right next to them on the pillows on which they had slept. Now, key moment coming up. Macbeth says, "Oh, yet I do repent me of my fury that I did kill them." Macbeth is admitting here that he has killed the two guards outside Duncan's chamber. Now, this is a very foolish thing that he has done, because it is now arousing Macduff's suspicion. Macduff says to Macbeth, "Wherefore did you so? Why did you do that?" Now, although Macduff is quite subtle here, he is now suspicious, because what Shakespeare intends the audience to understand here is, why was Macbeth so keen to have the guards killed? Now, we know the answer. The reason he's done it is because you almost get the impression that in the cold light of day, Macbeth has realised that plan we had to frame the guards, what if someone questions them? They'll deny it, and they'll probably mention that Lady Macbeth was there getting them drunk the night before. And it's almost like he has this moment of clarity. Do you know what? I've got to do something. I've got to get rid of them, which is indeed what he does. But of course, Macduff's suspicion is now aroused, because with Macbeth killing the guards, no one has an opportunity to question them. No one has an opportunity to interrogate them. So Macduff is now wondering, why has Macbeth killed the guards? Why has he been in such a hurry to have them killed? Macbeth at this point realises that he's slipped up, because his next speech is a really exaggerated and overdone excuse as to why he killed the guards. It's like if you put on the spot when you've been caught out doing something wrong, and the tale that you create is an elaborate one in order to try to distract away from the awkwardness and the potential truth of the situation. So that explains Macbeth's rather over-the-top language here. So this is what he says. "Who can be wise, amazed, temperate and furious, loyal and neutral in a moment? No man. The expedition of my violent love outran the pauser, reason. Here lay Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood, and his gashed stabs looked like a breach in nature for ruin's wasteful entrance. There the murderers, steeped in the colours of their trade, their daggers unmannily breached with gore. Who could refrain that had a heart to love, and in that heart courage to make love known?" That is just a very elaborate way of saying, well, do you blame me? How could you expect me to behave in a moderate manner and let these guards off the hook when there was my wonderful king lying dead in his bed, covered in stab wounds? How could you expect me to do anything other than kill the guards? In his excuse, he sort of acknowledges that he has acted rashly. He says, "The expedition of my violent love outran the pauser, reason." In other words, I did not stop to think. I was so angered and so outraged that I couldn't stop myself. So this elaborate excuse for doing what he's done, Lady Macbeth, who's listening into this, realises that her husband is just digging himself a deeper and deeper hole. So she does something to draw attention away from him. Now, it's not mentioned in the stage directions. This is again another one of those examples where Shakespeare's lack of stage direction could make a first-time reader, not so much someone watching, but a reader think, what's going on here? She says, or rather cries out, "Help me hence, ho!" She pretends to faint. She pretends that she's been overcome with the emotion and the shock, and she pretends to faint in order to distract everybody's attention from her husband, who's just digging this deeper and deeper hole for himself. Macduff, ever the gentleman, says, "Look to the lady," and we're told in the stage directions, exit Lady Macbeth helped. She is carried away from the scene to be tended to get medical aid, which of course she doesn't really need because there's nothing wrong with her. Then we cut to a little scene, still the same scene, Act 2, Scene 3, but it's this little episode that takes place to one side. And it's a conversation between Malcolm and Donalbain, the king's two sons. Malcolm says to his brother, "Why do we hold our tongues that most may claim this argument for ours? Why aren't we saying anything when we are more deeply affected by this, affected closely by this, than anybody else?" Donalbain says, "What should be spoken here, were our fate hid in an auger hole may rush and seize us? Let's away, our tears are not yet brewed." Donalbain is really a rather minor character in the play. He only actually says anything of any importance in this scene. After this scene, he doesn't take part in the rest of the play. But what he does say is very wise. What he's saying to his brother here is, well, what can we say? What's the point of saying anything? Because we actually might be the next victims. He uses this metaphor, this image, almost like of a predator hiding in a hole, ready to leap out and grab them and kill them. He is saying to his brother, our lives could be in danger here. There isn't anything we can say. His solution is, let's away, let's get away from here. Our tears are not yet brewed. We're still too much in shock at the moment to actually cry over our father's death. Malcolm says, "Nor our strong sorrow upon the foot of motion." We go back to Banquo. Look to the lady. He's giving instructions. I'm not really quite sure why Shakespeare puts this line in here, look to the lady, because Lady Macbeth has already been taken off stage and is being looked after. Anyway, I don't know why he does that, but Banquo says, "Look to the lady, and when we have our naked frailties hid that suffer in exposure, let us meet and question this most bloody piece of work to know it further. Fears and scruples shake us. In the great hand of God I stand, and thence against the undivulged pretence I fight of treasonous malice." So Banquo is saying something practical here. He is saying, right, once Lady Macbeth's been looked after, let's all of us get together and discuss what's gone on and see if we can find out answers to what he calls this most bloody piece of work. So in a way, Banquo is encouraging them all to become detectives, to look and see if they can come up with any solution as to who must have killed the king. And he also mentions the fact that he believes that the murder has been committed because of the undivulged pretence. The undivulged pretence means he thinks that somebody has killed Duncan to become king themselves. Somebody who is not in line to the throne. We know, of course, that Malcolm's been named as successor. Banquo's being very perceptive here, very intelligent. He thinks he knows why Duncan's been killed. Somebody who's not entitled to the kingship has killed Duncan to get his hands on the crown. And so what he's doing here is he's committing himself to fight against what he calls treasonous malice. He's going to fight against this treason. Macduff replies, and so do I. He's committed himself as well. All of the other lords on the stage say, so all, yes, we're all going to unite together to fight against this treason. Macbeth, who is of course the traitor, nobody realises it yet, although we think Macduff suspects, he starts to coordinate everybody. Let's briefly put on manly readiness and meet in the hall together. Right, let's all pull ourselves together. Let's make sure that we get... remember, most of the people who are congregated here, they're all in their night attire. They're all in their pyjamas. They've just been got out of bed. So Macbeth is saying, let's pull ourselves together. Let's get ready. Let's get dressed in our normal clothes. And then let's all meet in the hall, the main room in the castle, together to discuss what's going on. Everybody there, apart from Malcolm and Donalbain, says, well contended, in other words, good idea, and everybody leaves, except Malcolm and Donalbain. The last words of this scene go to them. These two brothers, recently bereaved, their father has just been murdered, are coming up with a plan. Malcolm says to Donalbain, what will you do? Let's not consort with them. To show an unfelt sorrow is an office which the false man does easy. So he's asking his brother, what are you going to do? Just like Donalbain, Malcolm is a very wise and perceptive individual. We see more of that later in the play because Malcolm is important later on. He's saying to his brother, we're not going to go to this meeting in the hall. Let's not consort with them. Let's not mix with them, because to show an unfelt sorrow is an office which the false man does easy. In other words, any one of them could be the murderer. And it's very, very easy to pretend that you are innocent. And you can, if you've done wrong, you can very easily show a sorrow which you don't really feel. The reason that this line is so important is because it's demonstrating that Malcolm is actually much wiser than Duncan. Remember, one of Duncan's faults is he was too trusting. He trusted the original Thane of Cawdor. That Thane of Cawdor betrayed him. He made Macbeth the Thane of Cawdor, trusting him, and now Macbeth has betrayed Duncan in an even greater way by killing him. Malcolm is not as trusting as his father. He does not go on appearances. He knows that appearances can be deceptive. So he's saying to his brother, let's not mix with anybody. We can't trust anybody. Any of them could be hiding the truth. So then he comes up with this solution. I'll to England. So Malcolm is saying, I'm going to leave Scotland, I'm going to flee Scotland, and I'll go to England. Donalbain says, to Ireland, I. So Donalbain is going to leave Scotland and go to Ireland. Why are they going to do this? Donalbain says, our separated fortune shall keep us both the safer. Because Donalbain is concerned that whoever killed their father might then try to kill them, the murderer is going to have a much harder job if Malcolm and Donalbain separate. So they're going to split up to keep themselves safer. Donalbain then says a really key line. This is another one of those that I would commit to memory. Where we are, there's daggers in men's smiles. In a way, he's echoing what Malcolm's just said. Any one of these individuals in the castle, any one of these lords, could smile at us, but that same person who's smiling at us could kill us. Hence, where we are, there's daggers in men's smiles. He continues, the nearer in blood, the nearer bloody. The nearer in blood to Duncan, in other words, the closer we are to Duncan, and you don't get much closer than the sons, the more likely it is that we will be the next victims. That's what Donalbain means by the nearer bloody. Malcolm then concludes the scene by saying, this murderous shaft that shot hath not yet lighted, and our safest way is to avoid the aim. He's speaking metaphorically and poetically here. He's describing this plot that's clearly in motion now, And he likens it to the image of somebody firing an arrow. That's what he means by this murderous shaft that's shot. Somebody has started this plot in the same way that an archer might fire an arrow. But that plot is not yet completed. Malcolm continues the metaphor when he mentions that this murderous shaft that's shot hath not yet lighted, hath not yet hit its aim. So this plot isn't over yet, is what he's saying here. Therefore, we've got to get out of the way. In the same way that you would avoid an arrow that had been fired at you if you could, we've got to get out of harm's way, because we are in harm at the moment the longer we stay in Scotland. He carries on, therefore to horse, and let us not be dainty of leave-taking, but shift away. Let's get to our horses and let's get out of here. We're not going to hang around. We're not going to be dainty of leave-taking. We're not going to say goodbye to anybody. We're just going to go. There's warrant in that theft which steals itself when there's no mercy left. This is Malcolm justifying why they're running away. Because nobody can be trusted, because this is a dangerous situation as far as he's concerned. Normally, particularly now that he is next in line to the throne, he is the Prince of Cumberland. If you were going to leave, you would say goodbye to everybody, you would be polite about it, but Malcolm's saying we haven't got time for that. We need to steal away. That's why he uses the word theft. He's using a little bit of what we would call a pun here. They are stealing away. They are leaving the situation. They're not going to do it politely because their lives could be at risk. And so therefore he's saying it's not a crime for us to leave without saying goodbye to anybody, because as far as he's concerned, there is no mercy left. There is no safety in the location in which they currently are. So off they go into self-imposed exile. That just leaves one final scene of Act 2 before we move into the real chaos phase of the play in Act 3. So the next tutorial will be about Act 2, Scene 4.